Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am so excited to share with you Joanna Holden. And Joanna is the owner of Primitive Reflex Plus, which is an amazing company in the Denver area. And she agreed to be our guest speaker. So I'm super honored to have her today with us to share her wisdom and her knowledge with all of you on primitive reflexes. So Joanna, tell us a little bit about your background story, how you got into primitive reflexes, and then we can always dive deep into what those are.
Okay. I was one of those kids who never knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I tried a variety of different things. I have a bachelor's degree in French language and literature and thought I would end up teaching, but I didn't want to teach high schoolers. And since most elementary and middle schools don't offer languages, I ended up just sticking with what I loved, which was teaching gymnastics. So I did that for almost 20 years. I got turned on to the idea of occupational therapy, and I started occupational therapy graduate school, and that did not work out. I got really sick and ended up moving back home to Colorado. But after that, so my interest in just how the brain and the body work together was intrigued and piqued by occupational therapy and gymnastics. And I found this job as a sensory motor coach, and it sort of, it included everything that I was interested in, just about, and working with kids, which I've always loved. So I worked as a sensory motor coach for 3 years, and that's where I was introduced to primitive reflexes. And the company that I worked for did a small portion with primitive reflexes. And through my own research and working with a colleague, I found that is really, in my interpretation, the foundation of everything. You can do all sorts of other therapies, but they're really sort of top-down approaches. And what I want to do, and what I do at our current company, is that I work with the reflexes, which are a bottom-up approach. So really attacking the source of the issue and working with the source of those reflexes, which cause such a huge variety of symptoms for such a huge variety of the population.
Sure. Yeah, it's really interesting because after you and I sat down, I was like, oh my gosh, I think everybody has some kind of primitive reflex that they're, still trying to navigate in life or still trying to deal with in life. And I don't think that we in general are aware of them. So with that being said, please share with our audience what primitive reflexes are.
Well, let's start with what a reflex is. So a reflex is an involuntary response to some sort of stimulus. So if you reach out to touch a hot stove, you don't have to think about pulling your hand away. It automatically happens. You just jerk your hand away without having to go through the higher learning centers of the brain. Cool. So it's an involuntary physical response to some sort of stimulus. That's an example. Primitive reflexes, or sometimes they're called infantile reflexes, are reflexes that we have either when we are born, they form in utero, or shortly after birth. And they are a baby's survival mechanisms for after coming out of this nice, ideally warm, protected, soothing, calm, in utero environment. They're all of a sudden exposed to so many different stimuli that, yes, they've smelled certain things. Yes, they've heard certain things, but in the womb, it's muted, it's protected generally. And so they each have a purpose. And once that purpose is served, they're supposed to go away. For most of us, they do, but for some reason, well, for many reasons, first of which is trauma, and that can be real or perceived. But we'll get more to that later. For some reason, those don't go away. And if the reflexes don't go away like they're supposed to go dormant in a sense. They can impact the development that's supposed to come after that.
Okay. Yeah. So can you give me an example of a primitive reflex that you see, just in working with kids or even, young adolescents or whoever you're working with? What
of course. Like? Of course, I'll give you a couple examples if you want. So the first that I like to give is it's called the palmar grasp reflex. When you touch a baby's hand, what do?
They grab it.
They grab it, yes. And they're supposed to. It's a survival mechanism, but they don't have any control over that for the first, say, 4, 5, 6 months of their lives. It's just something touches their hand and their palm and they grasp. It's supposed to be that way. That's why it seems like babies love to grab onto people's hair. why babies seem to grab onto necklaces or earrings or any of those things and don't let go. It's not necessarily because they love us, even though they do love us and love that stimulation and attention. It's a grasp reflex. And so that is supposed to go away, usually by 4 to 5 to 6 months, right in there somewhere. So as an example, if you see a baby and they're lying on their back, they're like 3 months old, maybe not even, a younger baby, an infant lying on its back, and it has one of those toys, those like a little home gym kind of thing with the toys hanging down on a string. First, they just smack at it. They bat at it. Then when they touch it and it touches their palm, they'll grab and they can't let go. They have not learned that yet because the higher centers of the brain haven't picked up on that yet. As they age and that reflex goes away, they will be able to grab voluntarily, then let go voluntarily. And that in turn turns into the more mature pincher grasp, which allows us to hold a fork or a spoon. It allows us to hold a pen or a pencil. So in this particular case, if the reflex doesn't go away, anything that touches that kiddo's palm, and that I see it, I've even seen it in teenagers, frankly, anything that touches that person's palm is going to cause some level of involuntary movement. Okay. So as we get older, we come up with workarounds. We hold a pen or pencil funny. We hold our fork or knife funny. We use the other hand. So we come up with coping mechanisms to help, even though that clear process of development was kind of ruled out. Wrong word. We came up with workarounds to get around that normal process of development.
So in other words, like if you've got a kiddo who maybe is struggling with like handwriting, right? And the dexterity, a lot of that can be associated with those primitive reflexes, maybe not going away in their natural course, but still being maybe more prevalent than they should be for a child.
Right.
Age group.
Okay. Exactly. So they're still intact. Now reflexes are judged on a scale of 0 to 4. So it could be a 4 that causes a complete grasp. It could just be a 1 where the kiddo just feels ticklish.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Yeah. Another example that I love to give is the spinal galant reflex. So if you touch a baby's back on one side, they'll flex their hip to one side, that same side. If you touch their back on the other side, they flex their hip the other way. The purpose of that one is to wiggle their way through the birth canal, which I think is just ingenious. Yeah, it's their natural way of getting through that vaginal birth without having to think about it. They're not trying to help. They're not developed enough to try to help with that process, but this reflex kicks in and they wiggle their way through. If that reflex doesn't go away, and again, that can be trauma in utero, it can be trauma, parental trauma, it could be drug or alcohol use, it could be any number of different things. Yeah. But if that reflex doesn't go away and that kid gets older, as that child gets older, anything that touches that child's back is going to cause some sort of little involuntary movement. So those are the kiddos I see who can't sit still. They look like they have ants in their pants. If they do sit still, they jump up. Those are kids who need to, they come up with all kinds of creative ways to help them in the classroom, from standing at a standing desk to sitting on a wobble cushion, to sitting in a couch, or standing on a rocker board. So there are all sorts of ways to compensate for this. But really, the root of that particular issue is the spinal galant reflex that never integrated like it was supposed to.
So is it almost fair to say that, going back to this being kind of the root cause, the root issue, and I don't like the word issue, but, just the root cause of why this kid has these ants in these pants, or why they need to sit on a certain cushion, or why they're wiggling, or why they need to stand or jump, or whatever they need to do. It almost sounds like, although, occupational therapy is fantastic and we need in our lives, we need all the help we can get with some of our kids who are struggling. It sounds like, also being able to integrate this primitive reflex program that you have is helping to kind of calm that reflex down so that the kid can sit still for longer periods of time and can focus a little bit better on, whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing, right?
Very much so. Very much so. Imagine yourself being 5 or 6 in school and having to sit down in a chair and somebody's constantly poking at you. It just feels like being ticklish to them. Yeah. Something, or it's the tag in your pants or your belt or your waistband or the tags in your shirts or the way the fabric of the chair is rubbing on you. How can you possibly concentrate and focus and learn when that's going on?
Well, I was that kid. I'm still and I'm
yes.
And when I'm on the phone with people, I just kind of pace back and forth like this, and I'm like, I have to move. Like sitting still is very challenging. Doing videos like this is challenging. I'm literally standing because I can't sit still. So I'm like, I'm just gonna stand because it's easier for me to be somewhat more, just still when I'm standing.
Yes.
That's so interesting. So I mean, I think I know why primitive reflexes are important, but if you could summarize it for our audience, that would be fantastic. I think they're obviously picking up on it, but give us some reasons why these reflexes are, just important and important to treat too. I mean, I think we understand that they serve a purpose of survival for an infant, but if we don't treat them, we know what that looks like now. But what if we do treat them? I mean, how does that improve the quality of life for those kids?
Right. That's a gigantic question. So I think I'll start by giving another example of a reflex. And this particular one, in my view, is the most important. It's called the moro reflex. It's spelled M-O-R-O. I believe it was named for the person who discovered it or, named it. So the moro reflex is the baby's startle reflex. It's the precursor to the adult startle reflex. Okay. If you tip the baby on their tummy quickly without their head supported, or if you flash a bright light in their eyes or make a loud noise like a clap or a dog bark, the baby's face flushes, their eyes dilate, hands and legs fling out, and a huge breath in. And then they start to cry and tuck back in. There is some research that suggests that's related to the first breath of life.
Oh.
Isn't that neat? So that is the baby's way of getting attention when they feel a sense of danger or startled, scared, anything sensory that they've not been exposed to before. All of a sudden, they're exposed to all of these worldly sensations, and so that's their way of getting the world's attention when they feel like they need attention. Okay. So, for as an adult, if you are driving down the highway, you hear a loud noise, your brain thinks, oh, that's a siren. You look in your rearview mirror, you see, okay, there's an ambulance coming. I need to pull over. Sure. We all probably know that one adult, or maybe more than one adult, whose head hits the ceiling and they go into panic mode when that happens. Okay, that's an example of what it might look like if that reflex hasn't gone away. Okay. So what that reflex does is it kicks in the sympathetic nervous system. If your bear is chasing you, you want that sympathetic nervous system to help you get away from that bear and get to safety. Yeah. Now, if a bear is not chasing you, you don't want that system activated. You don't want your cortisol levels going sky high. You don't want to always feel like you're in danger.
Right.
So that is why it's so important to get these reflexes looked at, because if your moro reflex is intact, you're always in fight or flight and you don't even know it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. That's the biggest deal. So I've treated a couple of adults who have their moro reflex intact. And one of them said that once the moro reflex went away, she gave a couple of good examples. She said it was like the blues were bluer and the greens were greener. She said it was like turning the dial on a radio from constantly being on a static station to being on a music station.
Wow.
And everything just seemed much more calm. And the other woman said, it was like she didn't have to always be in control anymore.
Interesting.
She could just let things be. And that was a sensation that neither of these two people had felt before.
That is so interesting. I can't imagine how much more fulfilling their life is.
Right.
After being able to take that reflex and calm it down. I mean, that's really, really very interesting, because I think, as adults, if we're doing a lot of self-work and self-awareness and just self-healing and things like that, which a lot of the majority of people I talk to do work on.
Right.
I think we don't ever go to, primitive reflexes. It's like, I just need to learn to be more calm. And you do all the things to be more calm. And you're like, I'm still not calm. I'm calmer, but I'm still fully calm, or fully present and able to take back and pull in the richness of those greens and those blues, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever the case may be. That's really fascinating. So obviously you treat, I think we've talked about this briefly. I mean, you have mentioned adults, but
Mm-hmm.
do you still treat adults? Is it mostly children? What does that look like?
My preference is to work with children. I prefer school-age kids, so 4 to 18, or adults, case by case. I really look at that in terms of what their current coping mechanisms are, if they're healthy, how well they're working, and how willing they are to give up on some of those coping mechanisms.
Sure.
Because as adults, we find ways of coping. We find ways to calm down. We find ways to help ourselves. Sometimes those are not the healthiest ways.
Sure.
I worked
chocolate, and that is not
yeah.
not always a healthy option.
Well, correct. And there are limits, right? There are pros and cons to every coping mechanism. I had a 23-year-old that I worked with, and we got his reflexes to integrate, but his coping mechanism was drinking alcohol. And he stopped for the first 4 weeks of our program. We have an 8-week program, and we got fantastic results. And then he went to a concert with some friends and started drinking again. And then almost every subsequent session after that, he came hungover. Oh. He never came drunk. He was very intentional about not coming drunk, but he came hungover, and it pretty much undid the work we had done. And that was his choice.
Right.
It was his choice to continue to drink. And yes, I could keep treating him. Yes, I could keep making those reflexes go away if they come back up. But adults tend to have harder habits to break, and kids generally don't. So that's my preference. Plus, I just love kiddos.
Yeah, and so I'll tell our audience this, because I haven't shared with them, that, you did see my son for an initial evaluation.
Right.
I was blown away. Like, he said to me, he's like, "Oh my gosh, that was so much fun." Like, he was there to be evaluated. He's like, "I get to play." Like, that's what his thought process was. And I was like, fantastic. Like, whatever it takes to make him, be excited, or to, have fun and participate. Which, I think our audience needs to know that. Like, I certainly don't just interview anybody for these, interviews. And typically somebody that I've had a chance to meet with, form a relationship with, or I've had an experience with. You and I have talked about this, but I don't just refer anybody. Like, I don't believe in doing that from a business perspective. So, for anybody that's watching, I can tell you, Joanna's fabulous. Like, your kids are going to have a lot of fun with her.
Thank you. Thanks.
I got to have some fun too. I got to do a little balance beam. It was balance beam.
Yes, that's what you did. Yes.
I did a good job, right, Joanna? Like,
you did fantastic. Yes.
Fun. I was like, gosh, I feel like I'm playing. Like, this is
right.
Fun. Played in a while. How fun.
Yep.
So it was really fantastic. So for what should listeners do if they think their child has maybe some primitive reflexes that are still intact? How do they, what are the warning signs? And then if you could talk about, the next steps after they recognize maybe some of those warning signs.
Certainly. Well, to go back to your point about it being fun, is inhibiting the reflexes is all exercise based. So it's specific exercises. Some are more challenging than others. So I try to tailor it to the kiddos. As long as we're getting the exercise done the right way, we do all sorts of fun activities so they don't know that it's work. They think it's play. If you're noticing, there are so many different symptoms because there are 8 reflexes and they all impact development in so many different ways. Just to give you a handful, common diagnoses that I see, and I don't work with diagnoses at all because I really work with the root problems. And the diagnoses are groups of symptoms. So I'm looking at the individual symptoms. It could be lack of focus or concentration, inability to sit still, poor gross motor skills, poor fine motor skills, trouble hopping, skipping, jumping at an appropriate age, wetting the bed after age 5. And it's on our website. All of these symptoms and options are listed on the website. And those are just a handful. Difficulty learning in school, having a hard time making or keeping friends. There are social aspects of this too. The inability to cross that invisible midline down the middle of the body. You'll sometimes see people who read and they'll read one side of the page and then they have to turn their head to read the other side because their eyes don't want to cross that midline, or they don't want to work together when they're crossing the midline. Sometimes kids will write on one half of the page. And that can be a symptom of a retained ATNR, asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. So many others, poor handwriting, trouble sleeping, lots of different symptoms. So if they suspect that primitive reflexes are at play, with me, the first step is always a free consultation. So give me a call and we'll talk about your symptoms and the possibility to see if it's a good fit. From there, the next step is an evaluation. Our evaluation is $249 normally. And if any viewers want to call and mention this, having learned about this from your show, I will waive that fee.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
I will waive that, yes.
Somebody that's listening, take your kids to see Joanna. It's an amazing time playing for an hour.
Yes. And our office is in Littleton at Wadsworth and Coal Mine.
No, it's great. Like, I mean, I really appreciate you and your time and your insight. And, like I said, my son had such a good time just chatting with you and getting to play, because that was his perception of, what was going on.
Yes.
I was not going to make him nervous. I just wanted him to go and just be himself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that's amazing. And, as we get ready to wrap up, there's something I want to revisit real quick, just like in the next 2 minutes, but I want to just chat with our audience a little bit about trauma. So you hit on that a little bit, but
yes,
trauma is such a hard word for a lot of people, especially those who have gone through it.
Right.
And, it's something that you and I have spoken about. I've gone through trauma. I think we all go through trauma. Every adult out there goes through trauma, because trauma is based off of your perception of a situation, right? And
exactly.
Very well be traumatic, like not negating an individual's, perception of the trauma they're experiencing, but we all do it because our perception is how we identify and how we navigate reality for our lives, and how our brain interprets that information. So,
exactly.
One thing that I've found interesting is that a lot of professionals have started asking, like, what was your birth like? Like, what was your birth like as a mom? Like, were you sick when you were pregnant? And there's a reason they're asking that, because that trauma does impact the infant. And a lot of times I think in the past that was overlooked. So other than, a traumatic pregnancy or, a fall, like a physical fall that a kid might go through, or a baby, maybe experiencing just loud noises because they grow up in a loud place, or, trauma because parents are fighting. What are some other examples of trauma?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I worked with a kiddo who was 15, and for her, seeing a bee was trauma. I mean, literal trauma for her. She had sat on a bee when she was little, and had that massive memory in her head. One of her goals was, and she has subsequently reached that goal, but one of her goals at that time was to become a vet tech. And she was in high school, and so her initial step was wanting to go to the local shelter to volunteer by walking dogs. She couldn't do that because she was afraid to go outside. Because there might be a bee. So there are all sorts of different ways of working around that, but inhibiting those primitive reflexes, slowing down the side of the brain that increases that trauma response, was very effective for her. And now she's almost finished with her. She opted for a veterinary assistant program.
Oh, how cool.
And she's going through that in St. Louis right now. Other versions of trauma, like you said, it's real or perceived. It can be a memory. It can be having had fevers for, several weeks as a baby. It can be ear infections can be considered traumatic.
Those are all things I thought of, Joanna. Like,
exactly.
I wouldn't thought, a fever can be traumatic, or constant ear infections and being in physical pain. I wouldn't think of that. I mean, it makes sense, but it's not like, oh, this is trauma for someone. So it's really fascinating. That's very fascinating. How do our listeners get a hold of you? And just so everybody knows, like, I will put your contact information below in the comment section. But what's the best way for them to reach out?
The best way to reach out is probably via email. I'm Joanna, is JOANNA at PRI-PLUS. So it's primitive reflex integration -plus pri-plus.com. Our phone number, and that does come through to my cell if I'm not at the office, is 720-295-5788.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience before we wrap up?
Yes, what I want to impart two things on the audience. Number one, if reflexes are in play and are impacting your child's behavior and your family life, it's not your fault or their fault. It just is. Really, but take that blame off of yourself, off of your child, and let's reframe that and find a way to work with it instead of feeling bad and, shaming or being ashamed. Let's just take that off the table. Number two is there is hope.
Yeah,
there really is. We can make a dramatic change in your life and your family's life, and that's what I live for.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, because I think, as a special needs mom myself, and navigating that, there's been a ton of blame, and it, for people that maybe don't live in that world, that it feels really hopeless a lot of times, and
It
so
does.
I appreciate you saying that to the parents that are going to be listening to this, that are currently navigating those waters and feel a little bit lost, a little bit hopeless, and certainly are going through like, what did we do wrong? Like,
Right.
What if we could have stopped our kid falling down the stairs? Or what? I mean, you can't.
You can't. You can't turn back time. It is what it is, and start right here, right now, fresh.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been amazing getting to do this interview with you. Thank you to everyone out there watching, and make sure to check the comments and reach out to Joanna for that initial consultation. She's fabulous. I'm speaking from experience, and so we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me, Natalie. Bye.
Bye-bye.